Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Darrell Meyer, I represent Hardin County. Looking at your direct testimony on page 2, it says that you were engaged by Summit to provide services regarding both risk assessment and risk management. Is that right?
Yes.
Can you tell me where in your direct testimony you address the risk management aspect of the services you were providing to Summit?
Well, the risk assessment is the first step in risk management. So the risk assessment is a picture of the actual risks, and the actions to be taken after the risk assessment is part of the risk management.
All right, so it's fair to say that your direct testimony that was filed doesn't really address risk management?
I'd like to look through the testimony again, but I think we have mentioned some things. I have mentioned some things in my testimony that do fall into the category of risk management.
All right, well, perhaps we'll bump into those through my questioning. Would you agree that in the industry, risk management is a tool to, I guess, sort of determine the financial risk involved in industrial activity?
Well, risk can be measured in various ways. Financial risk is one way. Impacts to environment, impacts to human health are other ways to measure risk.
All right. Well, since I don't see it in your report, I'm just basing this on page 2 where you said you were engaged to provide risk management services. Did your risk management services involve trying to quantify any financial risk to Summit?
Yes, they did.
All right. Was that in terms of civil litigation, claims that might be brought against Summit in the event of a failure of the system?
In our preliminary risk assessments, we've chosen to monetize risks as a unit of measure, and we can include legal actions, additional regulatory actions, but so far in the preliminary risk assessments, we're focused on possible impacts to human health and the environment.
All right, and did you make some recommendations in terms of how much financial exposure there could be for this pipeline?
Yes, in terms of, again, human health and environmental possible impacts.
And what was the dollar figure that you derived from your risk management assessment?
Well, again, we're measuring risk in monetary terms, and our preliminary estimates for the amount of possible damage to human health and the environment are somewhere in the range of $10 to $20 per mile per year.
And what's the duration of this? How many years did you project as part of your assessment?
There is a design life in the document, but that generally does not refer to the lifespan of the asset. So currently we have no end of life for the asset.
So if, just for example, if there's 30 miles of this, or 35 miles, I think was one of the other witnesses testified, that their projections or numbers were based on 35 miles in Hardin County. If I take that times 10, that's $350 for Hardin County each year. Does that seem like a fair way for Hardin County to look at this?
Well, this is the way that expected loss as a measure of risk works. It takes the expected loss over a large period of years and it annualizes that. So approximately $350 per year in Hardin County would be a reasonable estimate of the type of damages that could occur to Hardin.
And you've prepared a report for Summit regarding all of these numbers, correct?
No, we are preparing databases and profiles of risk. We're in the data phase. We are not in the reporting phase.
Who at Summit have you been working most closely with?
Originally, it was the head of engineering, Lynn Meredith. Currently, it's Alex Lang.
And what does Mr. Lang do? What's his title?
I believe Mr. Lang is the manager of engineering.
So this is a 3,300 mile pipeline, is that right?
I believe it's 2,060 miles.
And we can add another zero on the end of that for your $10 per mile. So if you would say that at this point, if they held $26,000 aside each year, that would be a reasonable reserve for Summit to hold back to cover any catastrophic loss.
That would only assume that the possible incidents would be spread uniformly year to year. So in theory, what you're saying is correct, but of course, the way real life incidents work, there would probably be zero damages for many, many years, and perhaps an incident that is more expensive, and then zero damages for many, many years after that.
So, because the life of this is eternal, how much do you believe should be held in reserve, even from day one, because that catastrophic event could occur on day one? What should be held in reserve?
Well, that's a question that goes to insurance and financial strategies, which is beyond my scope of expertise.
All right. Did you work with anybody at Summit that would have had that expertise or at least interest in that topic?
We have not yet engaged, or I have not yet engaged with Summit, anybody who's involved with the insurance and the long-term financial budgeting, no.
Have you been involved in other projects that might that may have arrived at some sort of similar risk management conclusion? $10 per mile per year. Have you ever had any other projects where you've worked on something similar?
Yes.
And ultimately, did it get to the point in your involvement then where they actually did arrive at a number? At what should be held in reserve or estimated, this worst case scenario, we may have to cut a check this big?
If such a determination was made, I was not made aware of it.
Are you able today, just, I guess, from your seat on the fly here, able to say that, give a number with some level of comfort, how much should be held in reserve?
No, I'm really not, because again, the insurance and financial planning aspect is not in my scope.
But was that part of what you were engaged to do?
Objection, Your Honor. Asked and answered calls for speculation. The witness has been asked several times and replied several times that it's not within his scope to make decisions about financial reserves or insurance. Mr. Meyer.
I want him to clarify whether he's been hasn't done that yet, or whether he's never been asked to do that.
The
witness may answer the question, and then we can.
I have not done that, and I have not been asked to do that.
Are you aware of whether anybody, any other outfit, internally within Summit or externally, has been asked to do those calculations?
I am not aware of anyone being asked.
Did your services involve consideration for any decommissioning? What it would cost to remove the pipeline at the end of it all?
No, they did not.
I don't have any other questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Long, OCA.
Thank you. Mr. Muhlbauer, my name is John Long. I'm an attorney with the Office of Consumer Advocate. You had some helpful discussion with you just had some helpful discussion with Attorney Meyer. I'd like to follow up on some of that. Do you recall that you explained that the $10 to $20 per mile per year is, I believe you called it an expected value? Is that accurate? An expected value of potential damage resulting from the line?
It could be phrased that way. I use the term expected loss.
Expected loss, okay. Would you have calculated that? Obviously, the calculation would be more complicated than this, but for a very simple event, would you agree that it would be essentially the dollar amount of the event multiplied by some fraction representing the likelihood of the event happening in a given time period?
Yes, the magnitude of the event and the frequency with which that event may occur.
Then, picking up on what Attorney Myers was discussing with you, could you tell us the dollar amount of the magnitude of the event that you would have used in your calculations to arrive at the 10 to 20 per mile per year of a sort of a single event, that what the dollar amount of that loss would be?
Well, there's a range of possible scenarios that could unfold if there's a pipeline incident. So there's a range of costs that could be associated with any incident. So I'm not sure I can answer your question in a single number.
Thank you. There would be a range, and each would have its own probability. What was the maximum end of the ranges you looked at?
Depending on the level of conservatism, and we've run scenarios involving very conservative outputs and very non-conservative or more realistic outputs. As I recall, the range or the upper range in the possible consequence scenarios are on the order of $1 to $2 million per incident.
And to clarify for the record, when you say conservative, do you mean using assumptions to reach the highest possible dollar amount of loss or damage, or conservative meaning the opposite?
Yes, when I use the phrase conservative, I mean we're intentionally overstating the actual risk, meaning we're building in a lot of deference or bias towards the higher end of what could happen, the more expensive end of what could happen.
That's all my questions. Thanks.
Thank you. I neglected to say we plan to break around noon, so shouldn't that be a problem? Go ahead, Mr. Jorde.
Thank you. Now, sir, I noticed the name of your consultancy entity. The first letters are WKM, and those are your initials, correct?
Yes.
And how many folks do you have working with you there?
2 full-time?
Including yourself?
Yes.
All right. And approximately when were you hired on for this summit project?
I believe it was early in 2022.
You state in your testimony, quote, "The risk assessment on the proposed pipeline system begins with an assessment of threats to the pipeline," end quote. Do you stand by that as the starting point?
Yes.
And isn't it true from the pipeline company, their primary goal here is to protect their asset, which is the pipeline and any appurtenant structures?
Well, the primary goal is to avoid loss. So that would be avoiding any damages to the surroundings and protecting the asset.
You make the statement, quote, "Decision makers use the information provided by the risk analysis to determine the optimal protections to manage risk along all portions of the pipeline system," end quote. Who's included in decision makers?
Typically, it's all levels of the organization. The field personnel have some ability to make changes, make protections, all the way up to the board of directors who sets the budget for what can be done to protect the pipeline further if necessary.
And so your analysis there, decision makers relative to risk, has nothing to do with the decisions that a farmer, rancher, or landowner would make, right? They're not part of the decision makers.
Well, as stakeholders, by virtue of them being neighbors to the pipeline, they are involved in the risk management. They have to comply with the right-of-way easements and exercise the cautions and the protections that are incumbent upon them on that easement.
And in order for them to do that, as in your word, a stakeholder, it would certainly be important for them to have the best and latest information in terms of risk so they could appropriately go about their daily activities, right?
It's important for all of the public to understand pipelines, to understand what actions might be necessary in the rare event that something goes wrong with that pipeline. And most importantly, they need to understand what their role is in protecting that pipeline.
So you think they have a role in protecting Summit's asset? Where would you put that on the hierarchy of importance of protecting themselves and their family, or protecting the pipeline asset? Which kind of comes first, you think?
Well, those are not either or. They work together. Again, the public has a certain responsibility not to damage the property of others, and that's why we have systems in place like the 811 system.
You state that the Summit risk assessment addresses all known threats to pipeline system integrity. Are you aware that they have not yet conducted phase 2 geohazard surveys?
We have incorporated geohazard survey information. The extent or the portions of the system that may not yet be complete, I'm not aware of how much of the system has been completed and how much has not.
You utilize the desktop data and not the field data, correct?
I don't think that's correct. I think at least in some locations we have detailed field data that we're bringing in already.
And so in order to say that their risk assessment addresses all known threats to the pipeline system, that statement can't be true until we have a full understanding of all of the phase 2 geohazard surveys and the data from those surveys, right?
Well, the risk assessment can address all of the geohazards, but it might require some estimation pending the final reports, the final detailed information.
And you've got some testimony relative to risk analysis in PHMSA, and ultimately the first step is for the pipeline company to satisfy PHMSA relative to their risk analysis requirements, right?
Correct.
And PHMSA doesn't have any risk analysis requirements as to the ultimate location or siting of a hazardous pipeline, right?
Right.
And then lastly, sir, you state that the Summit system will have have even lower risk levels, as much as 3 times lower. Now, you can't make that statement. You can't use the word will, correct? That's going too far. You, sir, aren't going to warranty the safety, integrity of this system, right? It would have been more appropriate to say, in your opinion, you believe it may have lower risk levels, not that it will have, correct?
I'd have to see the exact sentence, but it may have been more useful to have prefaced that with, based on the current information, the incident rate will be 3 times lower, or could be 3 times lower, or should be 3 times lower.
Okay, yeah, I appreciate that clarification. I don't have anything further. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there further questions from the parties? Okay. You want to take them? They're mine. Go ahead. No, unless you want them.
All right, Mr. Muhlbauer, just for clarification on the record, could you again describe what is a mile year, just for clarification?
It gives us a sense of the analysis area. So, for example, 1,000 miles of pipe operating for 1 year would be 1,000 mile years. Or 1 mile of pipe operating for 1,000 years would also be 1,000 mile years. So for a long linear asset, we need a unit of measure like that to not only capture how long the asset's been there, but also the length of the asset. So mile years is our unit of measure to tell us the analysis area.
It provides you a chance to make apples to apples comparisons, if you will.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you. On page 5, lines 17 through 21 of your direct testimony, you describe how Summit Carbon intends to update its risk assessment. Could you describe what you mean by meaningful change?
Well, the expectation by the regulator, PHMSA, is that at least annually the operator will update its risk analysis. Now, there's also language in the regulation that says, in addition to that annual update, anytime the operator has knowledge of changes in risk factors, he should be updating his risk analysis.
Is that applied to the whole system or just a localized area where that change occurred?
Well, the language in the regulation says he only has to do that in the HCA areas, but Summit has volunteered to apply that kind of criteria across all 2,000 plus miles.
And then for an operational change, would an updated dynamic segmentation occur again for the whole system?
Yes, actually, if any data changes anywhere along the line, there would be a new dynamic segmentation exercise.
Okay, that's all the questions I have. Thank you, sir.
Summit?
No redirect, John.
Right. Thank you. Mr. Muhlbauer, you may step down. Thank you.